What I thought I would do today is to really focus in Book 1 on Chapter 1, or I think it's called Chapter 1. Yes, on Chapter 1, and to go through in some detail the evolution of a fairly complex train of thought, a kind of argument, and to do that for a few reasons. One is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, the way in which I see what the purpose is of us meeting every week and me speaking and us having a discussion is not to go through every bit of the text that's assigned and explain it and lecture about it, but to identify or to seize on it, to spend some time, get into the details, and then that means that a number of, certain parts of text are not things that we'll discuss explicitly, or I won't discuss explicitly, even though I encourage you, if you have read something, or if there's something that you think is really important and you want to bring to bear to the classroom, then by all means do so. So what I would propose is to go through, it's also philosophically the richest part, which is Chapter 1, Chapter 1 of Book 1, and to what I've tried to lay out here is to, and this will be sort of the map of the discussion today, there is a kind of rigorous structure of reasoning in the text. Now, as you know, as I mentioned last time, Clausewitz never finished on war, though Book 1 is the most finished. But even Book 1, and even Chapter 1 of Book 1, though it's the most finished of what he had prior to his death, it's still, you can see it's a text that's really searching, so it's philosophically still in motion. As well, it's a text that, as a text, is just not finished. But there is nonetheless, and I thought that that's going to be the kind of plot, the narrative for today, is to show that there's a fairly sophisticated, let's call it argument or process of reasoning that centers around or that is anchored in a very simple formulation. So again, you see something about how the intellect of Clausewitz works. He starts with a very simple, we started to talk about this last time, the first definition is war is a duel. And it seems very simple. Indeed, it's not even a definition, it's something like an analogy. And from that definition, then the rest of Chapter 1, and indeed then the rest of the book, is something like a fugue, in the sense that it takes this one basic, seems to be very simple, and think, okay, it's a duel, that's not a sophisticated idea. And as I mentioned, it's a very established way to compare or make an analogy between, so what kind of violence and war is, to make the analogy with a duel. And then from that, we'll see that there's tremendous complexity that starts to get generated. And this complexity then terminates or concludes in Chapter 1 with the most famous, celebrated, and this will itself be a kind of leitmotif for us this semester, the celebrated formula or definition, which I will repeat ad nauseum to the point that you will have it in your dreams. This semester, war is the pursuit of politics, whatever it means. And then, and we'll talk about this was sort of how I thought we'll end the discussion today, a fascinating uber complication, so to speak. Because just at the point where, beginning with a very simple image, war is a duel, and then the complexity that starts to emerge from that. And then it arrives back at a fairly simple definition. The meaning of it is very complex. So you can see that the arc is, I begin with something simple, war is a duel, kind of definition, and I end with a definition which is not exactly the same definition that I started with. So in a sense, what Clausewitz is doing is sort of generating his new definition, again, new in the sense he explicitly states it that way, from a point of departure which is very classical. So in the sense that the development of this text also is the arc of the revolutionary development of Clausewitz's thinking, beginning with a very classical conception of war as a duel, and then ending up with, as you know from the legacy of Clausewitz, the definition of modern war, up until, let's call it, the late 20th century, where people start to wonder whether now we've moved to something else. However, just when you arrive at the celebrated definition, or what came to be the celebrated definition, then Clausewitz, and again you see it's a real It's a real honest thinker, since he's never arrives at a point of rest. Then Clausewitz sort of pulls this, I don't know, it's a cliche image, this strange rabbit out of the hat in a very brief paragraph where he introduces what he calls the paradoxical trinity. And I'll end up by saying some things about, it's a fascinating idea that has deep resonance with Plato and Plato's Republic and the tripartite conception of the Platonic soul. And this paradoxical trinity, so what he calls the paradoxical trinity, many interpreters of Clausewitz consider this to be not simply an additional concept or definition of war vis-a-vis the celebrated definition, war as a pursuit of politics by women, but indeed, and this is Raymond Aron's argument, something like an alternative. And Raymond Aron, the French philosopher, who wrote a very interesting book, fascinating book, very meticulous in historical detail, argues, and we'll come to this at the end, that actually this suggestion, this glimpse of another conception of war, or an additional one, through the paradoxical trinity, would have been Clausewitz's mature statement had Clausewitz lived past the cholera epidemic. So just to anticipate, the end of chapter 1 is quite fascinating because you get the logical derivation, if you wish, of the celebrated definition, and then immediately after you get this other, I wouldn't call it a counter definition, another way to conceptualize war. And there's a lot of interesting questions between whether one is a further, more sophisticated version of this, whether it's different, and so there's a lot of interesting questions there. And for us as philosophers, since again we're reading this text primarily from a philosophical point of view, not from a military point of view, and also not from a historical point of view that we talked about briefly last time, it's quite fascinating that, as I'll end, in a sense, it is a conception of the Platonic soul from the Republic. Now, we'll see transformed. It's not exactly the same. It's not appetite and things like that. But basically, this idea of the macro and micro. So the soul, as you remember in Plato, the soul writ large is the polis and has different parts. And that is symmetrical structurally to the individual soul, such that you can only understand the soul of the individual through telling the story of the soul of the Republic, of the polis. And then justice, to remind you, is the way in which the different parts of the soul, both at the individual and then most importantly at the level of the polis, then each operate in their proper function and in harmony with the other. And we'll see that in Clausewitz, though, again, he's not a philosopher, he's a military thinker. But it's clear that it's implied that you have something like this conception of the soul in the problem of justice as the proper functioning of the different constituent, I'll put it in a modern vocabulary, the different constituent stakeholders in war, of which we'll see there are fundamentally three: the government, the army, and the people. And so justice would be, again, justice not in an ethical sense, in a modern sense, but the proper functioning of war would be a context in which the three parts function properly. So we'll see, it's quite a fascinating idea, though Clausewitz just puts it on the table and then, I want to be flippant, but dies. He never developed it further. That, I guess that would be the job of us as philosophers. Okay, so that's just to get a sense of the narrative. And again, what I thought we would do is I'll just sort of go through and try to sort of lead us through the structure of this reasoning, the structure of this argumentation. Let's say I'll speak for half an hour, 40 minutes, just to present it to get there, and then we'll just see if we can generate a discussion about what we've looked at, as well as anything else that we want to talk about or you find interesting. Okay, so let's go back to where we began last week. So sort of we'll rewind and repeat a bit the end of what we were talking about last week. So you'll recall that Clausewitz says, look, I don't want some abstract conception of war. And I don't want to, as we would say in American idiom, beat around the bush, and I just want to get to the heart of the matter. I want the core, and the core is going to be this idea of the dual, which, as I've said already, is a very traditional way to think about war, through that analogy, through that image. And here, let me just sort of repeat a bit what I talked about last week, just to get us back into that sort of mode of thinking. What's important about the image, or the metaphor, is, again, in a very typical Clausewitzian manner, the image of the dual already contains the most elemental parts of his conception of war. So it's already implied. So then if you're a Hegelian, the totality is already implicit in the point of the beginning, the point of departure. Though you cannot understand that totality until you go through the dialectical unfolding of the total view. So in a sense, the end is already at the beginning. And here, just repeat, and then we'll see if you have any questions about that, so things that I presented last week, which I'm repeating here. The important idea is, of course, that the notion of the will, that the dual is a contest or an antagonism of violence. He uses the word force, but violence today, I think, is more poignant. It's fundamentally the structure of an interaction, something that Clausewitz will repeat. And what this then already tells us, and here I'll just state it, and if you have questions about it, we can talk about it, but I've developed this last time, is the emphasis on will, and the use of force, or I'll call it violence, to compel, and here I'll put it in a more philosophical, more modern vocabulary, to compel another's freedom, to do something against its own freedom. So violence is an instrument. And here this is quite important, that this is an instrumental conception of violence. A means. And so violence is an instrument to compel wills, so freedom. And this then implies, and I'll just make the key words, that one of the fundamental structures of violence is recognition. And here I won't go into it, but it would be quite interesting to start to make interesting comparisons with, of course, Hegel's famous analysis of master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology of spirit. Why recognition? Precisely because I have to recognize my opponent as a freedom, as a will, as an acting autonomous agent. So we have violence as an instrument for the problem of freedom, so it has to be freedom. And then a structure of recognition in the encounter of violence itself, which, if you think about it philosophically, is an interesting idea, that the structure of violence as an intersubjective structure is a structure of recognition. Again, Clausewitz doesn't spell that out, but it's absolutely clear. And the last point, which I'll mention just by way, again, summarizing what I talked about last time, since sometimes I was drawing out, is it's completely unstated at this point in Clausewitz's text, but then when you get to the end, it's absolutely clear that the parties here involved are political agents. So, unlike a duel in the 19th century, which was between, one guy and another guy, and the guy throws the glove down and they go out in the morning and shoot their pistols at each other. Those are private individuals. That's about honor, whatever. The complex ritual of dueling, as you know, was quite established in Europe until the early 19th century. But it's quite important that we only learn this towards the end of this chapter, that here the agency, so the agents, or the subjects, if you wish, are political nation states for Clausewitz. For him, that's going to be axiomatic. that only comes out fully at the end. So war is an intersubjective relation, an encounter, an interaction of violence that involves a form of recognition, and that recognition is fundamentally a recognition between two political states. And the last thing I'll just say, and see if you have any questions or thoughts on this, and then I'll launch into sort of the new territory vis-a-vis yesterday, last week, is what you have then come out very elegantly is the basic distinction between instrument and means. Instrument and goal. So precisely, violence or force is the instrument or the means, and like any instrument, it has to have a purpose. That purpose is going to be a political decision among agents who are political agents. And again, by political agents, it means nation state. Clausewitz has a much narrower conception of political agency than we do today. So again, from a Clausewitzian point of view, if one takes it at the letter, then the current troubles in Israel between Palestinians and Israel is one between the state of Israel, which is a legitimate political agent and actor, and the Palestinians, which ambiguously are not. Again, we'd have to decide whether the Palestinian Authority is recognized, whether the Palestinians on the street are themselves instruments of the state, or are they autonomously acting individually. So from a Clausewitzian point of view, again, if you read it very narrowly, the current conflicts, I'll put it very paradoxically, from a Clausewitzian point of view, and this will sound a bit absurd for us today, there are no wars going on right now. I mean, in Ukraine, there's no war going on, strictly speaking. In Syria, there is no war going on, strictly speaking. And what, sadly might be the next conflagration in Palestine, in the occupied territories in Israel, that's also not a war. Why that's important, because you might say that's, seems anachronistic. It's a war of some type. Why that's important is because already you sort of see from this very simple idea of war as a duel, it comes out much more fully at the end. And I talked about this last time, that if war is an instrument, a means, then not only must we analyze that means, but we need to know what is the proper end of war. And the proper end of war, so why war is a rational instrument, is to arrive at a political decision. And if you think about it that way, then the apparent conservatism of Clausewitz's thinking has a very interesting consequence, which is, for Clausewitz, the reason why Syria, Ukraine, and clearly the conflict in Israel and Gaza are not wars, is that there doesn't seem to be any clear path to a political decision. So you have violence that goes through various cycles that will follow, as we'll see, this quite brilliant analysis of the inner dialectic of violence towards extremes, the counterpoises. It's almost a poetical expression that he uses, the pulsation of violence. So you have you have the first intifada, and things are fine. Then you have another one, and things are fine. Then you have another one. So this sense in which there's this sort of rhythm to violence. But this is, in a sense, an instrument that has lost its proper sense of object. So it's so in a sense, because it's not an instrument that's geared into or aims at political decision, and in order to have that horizon of the political decision, the parties involved must recognize each other as political parties. So, again, I'll just use the example to be provocative, precisely because Israel does not recognize the Palestinians as a genuine political agent, and likewise the Palestinians don't recognize Israel. Again, of course, we could have a massive debate about this. But from a Clausewitzian point of view, that's the reason why you have a pulsation of violence. And this then comes out from this idea of the dual, this very important distinction between the instrument, which is rational, and the means, as a means, and then the end or the objective, which is also a kind of rationality, which is political. And in a sense, reason is the ability to understand the right relationship between instrument and end. And again, for those of you who are familiar with Kant, this is a central idea in Kant. But that's what rationality is about, is knowing what is the proper object of an instrument. As you know, in the dialectic, there's a very interesting discussion about what is, if reason is an instrument, what is it an instrument for? So we need to know what are the proper ends of reason in order to know how to employ reason properly. That's what Kant means when he says the critique of pure reason. We have to know how to employ reason properly. Because up to now, we're sort of, we don't know the proper means of employment of our own instrument, which is reason, because we haven't clarified what the proper object of reason is. And the critique is the attempt to clarify the proper object of reason so we can delimit the proper function of reason. In Clausewitz, you have, I wouldn't say the same, because again, Clausewitz is not a philosopher of the sophistication of Kant. He's a military thinker, but you see that there's tremendous sophistication in formulating or attacking the problem of war through a very similar kind of way of articulating the question of war in terms of instrument and object. And then that's why the first chapter of the book has a very clear structure. Once we have introduced the idea of instrument and means, instrument and object as the distinction, which is the distinction between violence and politics, then what we need to do is look at the instrument. And as we look at the instrument, you'll see that the idea of judgment becomes very important in the pivot, if you wish, of the development. And then we pass into an understanding of what is the object, and we bring the two together in the celebrated definition: war is the pursuit of politics by other means. You had a question?
Yeah, I had a couple questions. My first question was along the lines of, because war has to be within the context of two states recognizing each other, but giving each other sort of like recognition and legitimacy when they call upon war, how would Clausewitz take a view of something like an independence movement, where you have a people who don't have official political autonomy within a region, and that they gain some sense of political or social awareness, and therefore strive to begin to fight for their rights, but they do not necessarily have them yet, they're fighting to establish that? Would that still be termed a war, or is...
So, from a strict Clausewitzian point of view, meaning without any fancy interpretive work, if you just read the text, that's not a war. Precisely for what you said. Now, your question is absolutely central and fascinating, and when you become mookified, which is the verb I've just invented, when you take on a mook identity and a mook presence, so you become mookified. I'm going to copyright that, please nobody tweet it, we heard it first here. When you become mookified, in the mook, there will be things to read, and we will talk about the problem of anti-colonialism and colonialism in the 20th century, and the way in which two thinkers in particular, Lenin and Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, precisely what they're interested in is exactly what you're saying. And they're going to say, wait a minute, actually, we'll see Lenin has this absolutely, it's kind of a brilliant, radical view. The only true war is civil war. But not civil war between parties within, the Roundheads and what the other guys were in the Civil War, but between the proletariat and the bourgeois. That's the only true, or what he calls perfect or paradigmatic war. So it's not between nation states, it's between those who are the state and the people. And that's a legitimate war. And so, in a sense, the entire thrust of Marxist anti-colonial conceptions of war, beginning with Lenin, moving through Mao, because Mao also wrote some quite interesting texts. Mao had read Clausewitz, and also fuses it with this other tradition, this Chinese tradition, Sun Tzu and things like that. And then Sartre as well, Frantz Fanon, I mean, they're all going to say, wait a minute, we're colonized people, we're not even recognized as wills. Because we're, native Africans, or we're not political agents, we're subhuman, or we're just barred recognition because we're not, we don't have a state, etc. They're going to argue that that actually is the more salient problem about war in the 20th century in the context of colonialism. But to come back to Clausewitz, Clausewitz still remains a thinker of his time. Now, Clausewitz sees on the periphery of his vision, historical vision, precisely that phenomenon, because as I mentioned last time, if one were to really understand what was revolutionary in terms of warfare between, let's say, the 1790s, which are Napoleon's great campaigns in Italy, in northern Italy, when he was a very young general, up until Waterloo. Actually, it turns on two axes, if you wish. One is the Napoleonic Wars of Napoleon, centered around the campaigns of Napoleon, as we talked about them yesterday. I guess we always think that last week was yesterday. The other is, as I mentioned briefly, the first appearance in modern memory of that time. Of course, there had been things like that before. The peasant rebellions in the German peasant wars, which Engels wrote a very interesting study of. They try to look back and say, look, the peasant revolts in Germany, that's already the model of the revolution. But for the memory of someone like Clausewitz, this is the first eruption of guerrilla warfare, which is Spain. And the Spanish campaign was a kind of disaster for Napoleon because precisely you had the Intifada. It's basically the same problem. So Clausewitz sees that there's that. And then the problem of civil war, so that's why your question is quite complex. Clausewitz also has, if you read more on war, you'll see that Clausewitz has a very ambivalent attitude, as I mentioned very briefly last time, to the idea of arming the people. Because a very important question, which again is implied in the paradoxical trinity, is who is the army? What kind of actor is the army? And Clausewitz is a professional soldier, as we talked about last time. The army has to be professional, run by professional officers. So what you don't want is Blackwater involved. And outsourcing basically your military, which is basically what the American military is doing today. And what you also don't want is arming of the people. So, and it's, again, he doesn't really have any comments about the outsourcing to Blackwater. He obviously knew that mercenary armies existed in the 30 Years' War. There was a comment about it last time. But he does have some interesting observations about arming the people, because there was important reforms in the Prussian army that introduced the idea of conscription and arming the people, what they called Landwehr and Landsturm. And Clausewitz has an ambivalent attitude towards that.
Just one question that just raised just now. In terms of this Trinitarian division between the people, the governments, and the military, is the military inherently tied to serve the aims of the government?
Yes, we'll come back to that.
Okay.
You can see, or you should be able to see that this very straightforward, the instrument is always determined by the object. Then as you evolve along, you will see that in the celebrated definition, war is the pursuit. The military is always the instrument of the state.
Well, what if?
So it cannot act autonomously.
But even if it rejects, can not military leaders reject necessarily the mission of the political leaders if they say they want to carry out something akin to a genocide or?
Yes, but for Clausewitz that's self-evident because he's a professional soldier. Again, he even has a comment where he says, and it's a kind of a dodgy passage where he says, look, savages are much more cruel in their war than us civilized Europeans, because us civilized Europeans, we're not going to rape and pillage and things like that. Now, of course, we can
questionable.
Yeah, it's clearly indefensible. It's completely ignorant of so-called savage, warfare, etc. But you can see it reflects a certain sensibility, and it reflects an attitude that professional soldiers part of their sense of honor as being soldiers is knowing that you don't, well, I'll put it in historical context, you don't go around exterminating Jews. When, and that's why the historical context of Germany is actually quite important, when the professional army, when the German Wehrmacht starts pursuing political objectives, which are from a military point of view nonsensical, then they're failed in their role of being professional. So the Clausewitzian critique of the Wehrmacht in World War II is that they didn't remain a professional instrument. Because again, running around with Einsatzgruppen in Poland is, from a military point of view, pointless.
It doesn't serve the ranks.
Yeah, so there is a way in which you can see the great subtlety of the simple model, where you can understand how the state of war doesn't function properly if each of the different functions either is not properly subservient to the objective or becomes autonomous as an instrument, or starts to conflate its own proper objective, which is the proper objective of the military is not political but military. Because the reason why you have generals is to fight and win battles, not to understand and decide what that decides politically. That's why for Clausewitz, as I mentioned last time, the beginning of a war is a speech act, which is a political speech act. Some sovereign state that has the right to declare war has to say, we're at war against Russia. And then once you have that, you have clarity, because you have to articulate what you're after. We want the Russians out of Donetsk and things like that. And then at that point, the military says, okay, that's what you want, this is what we do. So that's the sense in which, and we can come back to it because we're already getting to the end, but you can see, again, the great genius of Clausewitz is have very simple, at least apparently simplistic distinctions, which then you can, almost like a children's toy, you can play with and see you have tremendous complexity that comes out of it. And for people who are interested in policy, again, we're philosophers, we don't. But this is a very complex thing about, the military has its own interests, those are also political. And then how do we know, there's many instances, the Vietnam War, et cetera, where you have conflicts between the interest of the military and the interest of the state, and the inability to harmonize those. Okay, are there any other questions? And we'll come back to this because this is all in the Platonic soul. But just on the duel and or thoughts, basically repeating much of what was done last week, but just to give you an opportunity to say a few things before now we launch into, we continue. Okay, so the last point, Ray, is that ultimately the key point of war is to be politically decisive. And there's a very nice section that we'll come to where Clausewitz says, in war, nothing is ever a final result. Again, a very keen sense that violence itself is not a mechanism of political decision. Violence only becomes a mechanism of political decision in the context of a mechanism of political decision. And that's why, from a Clausewitzian point of view, you might say that our world today are endemic wars. So wars that resolve nothing politically. So wars, in a sense, which are completely removed from a political context of decision making. Okay, so with that in mind then, Clausewitz says, okay, let's think about force, violence, I guess we would call it today in English, as an instrument. So let's do a kind of analysis of violence. And here, he's going to set up this very sophisticated idea that, this is, I think, where we ended up last time. So if you think about the concept of force or violence as such, then there is no, so there's two claims that he makes. One is there's no inherent limit to the exercise of violence. And not only that, it's a more subtle claim, the very nature of violence as fundamentally an interaction or a structure of reciprocity namely, one party against another party. And here again, from a philosophical point of view, it's a very sort of deep insight into the nature of intersubjective, now everyone's interested in collective intentionality, we agents or plural agents, et cetera. In Clausewitz, you have a very clear idea that the fundamental structure of war is an intersubjective relation based on reciprocity. That reciprocity is then tied to recognition, because you have to recognize the other. And that precisely because war takes two, and the structure of their interaction is reciprocity, then from a purely conceptual or logical point of view, it is precisely this mechanism of reciprocity which in a purely ideal motion, and here you could think it's sort of like, it's sort of like a Newtonian idea, that if you just had a perpetual motion, so a motion which was not in gravity, which did not, so a pure motion which wasn't in a universe with the second law of thermodynamics, which is why there's no perpetual motion in our universe. Then, because it's an interaction of reciprocity, the inner dialectic of violence as an intersubjective structure of action, as indeed a collective action, then inherently moves to the extreme. So this is going to be the idea, what he calls that there's a tendency, as he says, to the extreme. So what we would call today escalation of violence. And this escalation of violence has something to do with the very logic of the intersubjective reciprocal nature of the encounter. So you might say that it's built into the very structure of the intersubjective relation, which is the relation of violence, qua war, that you have something like a tendency towards the extremes. And then these tendency towards the extremes, he's going to identify three different facets of that, three different features of that. One being reciprocity. Perhaps the most important one that I would draw your attention to is what we would call, using a more modern vocabulary, it's the vocabulary that the French anthropologist René Girard, who wrote he didn't write a book, but he had a series of conversations about Clausewitz, which were then written down and sold as a book. But he has this interesting idea to say, well, what this is really saying is that the fundamental structure of intersubjectivity in the context of violence is a mimetic structure. Mimetic in the sense that I act in a way that resembles how you act. So it's a really interesting idea that the very structure of the encounter of violence is, in a sense, not to be different, but to be the same. That's what René Girard calls the mimetic structure of violence. Precisely because, and here you can see that Clausewitz doesn't name it that, he doesn't have it, but he describes it that, you throw a rock at me, and we're not political agents, but I just use that intuitive. You throw a rock at me, and now I take a rock too and throw it at you. And then you develop new technology. You put that rock on a sling and you throw it at me. And so now I have to also do exactly what you're doing. Namely, I have to get a sling and invent that. And then in a sense you have the history of technology. Then you get a spear, and I get a spear. You get a crossbow, I get a crossbow. You invent gunpowder, I spy on you and get your gunpowder. So you can see that the very logic of an arms race is built conceptually into the very structure of the logic, if you wish, of war as a form of reciprocity, as a form of, as Girard would call it, mimetic behavior. So in a sense, what's interesting here is that even though fundamentally the nature of antagonism is about difference, I want something and you want something and we want something different. You want to take over Ukraine and I want to keep Ukraine free of you. Our behaviors are actually the same. Namely, you funnel troops clandestinely to some people and I clandestinely funnel troops to some people and deny it. And then, I deploy or you deploy, whatever, anti-aircraft batteries, and I deploy anti-aircraft batteries. So this is the nature then of the tendency towards the extremes, which is inherent to what Clausewitz is going to call the pure concept, or here, since we're philosophically minded, I'll call it the unschematized idea of violence. And then he's going to say, but wait a minute, not only is there, this is the real subtlety of the idea, not only is there this inherent tendency towards extremes, but then there is also what he calls in the translation, counterpoises, as he calls it. So here, again, if you want a philosophical vocabulary, there's something like transcendental schemas. Again, you remember in Kant, you have concepts. And then in order for the concept, and I'll give a very somewhat silly account, it's not more complicated than that, of course, but the concept itself is not an object of experience. It has to be schematized. There's some complex story about that. Precisely because I have to see the dog from different angles. I can't see the dog all at once. Clausewitz has the same idea that war has this tendency towards extreme and absolutes, but in reality cannot. Because of these other forces, counterpoises. So you can see it's almost some kind of mechanical idea he has. It's meant to be very dynamic. And these counterpoises, the two ones which I'll draw out, again, there's three. The important ones, they're all important, but the ones I'll just say a few things about this. One is human psychology. So human psychology, precisely that people make mistakes and bad judgments. The other one, which is very important, is contingency and friction. So you have a plan. And the other one, which leads into that, is this fundamental idea that no one has control. Precisely because, here, if you study game theory, this is axiomatic in game theory. And as I mentioned last time, many historians or military theorists really credit, if you wish, and I use that word because a lot of them do, they credit Clausewitz. They said, look, Clausewitz is the first one who, and he doesn't explicitly articulate it, of course he doesn't have the sophisticated tools conceptually that people have today, but this is a game theory conception of human action. It's game theory. It's all about probabilities. Namely, I have to ask, okay, would you do this? I'm thinking about what to do against you. And here, as you know, the wonderful thing about having enemies, just at the purely level of psychology, which is, I think it's underrated, the having of enemies. But it's important to have enemies, because when you have an enemy, you really think a lot about that person. So it's almost like you love them, right? Because they're always on your mind. And you're always really thinking about probabilities. Oh, if they do that, then I can do this. Or they emailed this person, I think I can do that. Or I know that they're vulnerable here because their cat died last week. I made an awful cat joke. So there's something about the attentiveness to the complexity of human action when you have an enemy. And that you decide what you do by imagining and thinking about what you think the other guy is going to do. And then the complexity of making the right judgment, what should I do against my enemy, is really a very complex problem of judgment in the context of probability. And here, I won't go into it because it's just a footnote, but I just mentioned, if you're interested, that, especially for the real military nerds among you, the idea of a war game, so in German, Kriegspiel, so now you can play war games online and things like that, actually was invented right at the end of the 18th century. And it's just in the 1780s, 1790s, and especially during the time of the Napoleonic Wars, that the most important developments in war games are by different generals and also different authors proposed war games with rules and probabilities and things like that. You may know that H.G. Wells wrote a book on war games, had his own rules and stuff like that. And this phenomena of war games with pieces and terrain, and you know, if any of you played war games, it gets quite sophisticated today, was something that Clausewitz was clearly in tune with, as well as the whole generation of German intellectuals at that time. So the German writer Kleist was completely obsessed with war games. And in fact, in a lot of Kleist's novels, you see this obsession with probability, contingency, you know, the broken jug just happens, and then all these spaces of action are opened, and people try to navigate it. So there's a kind of interesting cultural backdrop to this Clausewitzian insistence on loss of control and contingency, and the idea that war is a game. And of course it's deadly serious, but it's a game in which the problem of human action is in the context of probabilities. So it's game theory. Okay, so again, I won't get into more detail, but maybe we can just move through and then we can come back. But the basic idea here, again, it's pretty straightforward to see, is this notion that war as use of violence not only has this tendency towards extremes, there's no inherent limit, but then what sort of restricts the realization is these counterpoises, and then this idea he has that violence, because it has to be proliferated in space and time, cannot be instantaneously all at once. So these are the sections where he says, you know, war is not an isolated act, it's not a single act. And you might think, okay, that sounds obvious, but you can see it's a real philosophical idea that the nature of action is to be schematized in space and time. So violence, there cannot be the complete destruction of the enemy in one moment. Now, we'll maybe come back to it. That was the idea of nuclear warfare in the 50s and 60s, and that's why there are a lot of debates among military theorists about whether nuclear weapons is actually a military weapon, whether it fits into something like a military strategy. But precisely because then battles have to be spread out over space and time, they require resources, et cetera, et cetera. And the final point I'll just say about this, we'll move on, we can come back to it when we talk about what we just presented, what I just presented, is this absolutely important distinction between absolute and relative. Important for the way in which that distinction comes to be read in the reception of Clausewitz. As I already intimated last time, there is this tendency in the 19th century among various military establishments, but especially in Germany, to some extent also in France, to start to read Clausewitz in the following way. To say, look, what Clausewitz is saying is that when he says pure concept, he means the concept, such that war must be absolute, must be the attempt to maximize destructiveness. So the more we mobilize and strive for that aim, the more we realize the pure concept of war. So there is a way in which this distinction is collapsed. And this is, in a sense, the background to a lot of military thinking, again, in a very complex way. It's not direct, but in the First World War, and especially, but not only, but I just mentioned it, especially because it's the most flagrant example with the German military. In fact, Ludendorff, so you know, basically Germany was run by two dictators by about 1917, Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Ludendorff, after the war, writes a book called Der totale Krieg, where he sort of reflects on the First World War and basically thinks about war in this very extreme sense. Okay, let me just say a few more things to get to the celebrated definition of Platonic soul, and then we can open it up now for discussion. Now, precisely because you have this sense in which, in a sense, what Clausewitz is showing is the tremendous complexity of war. Not only conceptually, but remember that he's a soldier, and this book is meant to instruct soldiers. This then leads to a very important point which he stresses, which is the absolute critical function of judgment in war. And judgment, and you can see in many different senses, but again, just to use Kant as a reference point, As you know, Kant makes a difference between determinate judgment and reflective judgment. So the first critique. And then the third critique of judgment. And again, it's obviously very complicated, but basically the idea is that a determinate judgment is when a particular is determined through or by, let's call it the concept, whereas the reflective judgment is when the particular, in a sense, invokes or is an example for or determines the mode of, let's call it thinking. And here, as you may know, Arendt, in her, I think they were the last lecture course or last seminar she gave at the New School, which then she wrote into a very nice little book on Kant's political philosophy, argues that Kant's notion of reflexive judgment is, if you wish, the model or the basic form of political judgments. And here she's, of course, it's very influenced by Heidegger's interpretation of phronesis and Aristotle, et cetera, et cetera. It's clear that Clausewitz has the exact same phenomenon in view, that what is required in war, both in terms of the military, but also the politician, is good judgment. The ability to see the specificity of a context and to know what to do in a context of uncertainty and probabilities. And as you know, in Arendt, she argues that precisely the increased bureaucratization of democratic processes, the increased reliance on technological means of the military, meant that there was no longer true judgment. Because you can send a drone, or you can automate your decision-making process to release nuclear weapons, which, as you know, basically happened after the 50s. There's an absolutely fascinating book by the American writer Eric Schlosser about this. Actually, you shouldn't read it because it's absolutely horrifying. You know, how close the U.S. came to a nuclear catastrophe in the 50s and 60s, where some bomb drops out of a B-52 over Minnesota. But what Eric Schlosser in his book shows very clearly is because with the increase of technology and the development of ICBMs in the 50s, and then with nuclear submarines, a nuclear submarine that was in international waters off Cape Cod could launch a nuclear warhead and it would hit Boston in 12 minutes. So the command and control structure, you can't call Obama on Martha's Vineyard, and say, look, what do we do? And then call Minnesota or wherever and say, okay, launch or whatever. So they had to automate all of these systems because there's no human reaction time that's quick enough. And that's when they had to create NORAD. And so this is exactly, from a Clausewitzian, Arendtian point of view, the complete evacuation of judgment. There's no longer a human that decides. Clausewitz, again, for Clausewitz, the absolute centrality of judgment as a form of phronesis. So to see the particular circumstances and know what is the proper rule or concept based on understanding the context. And of course, for him, that's absolutely central to be a battlefield commander. So soldiers have to have excellent judgments. They cannot be robots. They cannot simply apply geometric principles of fighting. They have to, it was quite complicated, they have to look at the terrain, they have to look at this, they have to look at this, and then they have to make a judgment. The judgment has to be correct. So you can see this sort of theory of judgment as central to human action once one understands that human action is always in a field of probability and contingency. This then, again, just to bring us to the end of this discussion, we can go back and talk about things and discuss it, also other things, details which I didn't get into. This then is a kind of transition point to what I simply call the celebrated definition, where if you turn to this is in section, so it's at the end, so it's section 23. So you see the arc of the book 1, chapter 1. The first definition of dual is chapter 2. And then at the end, in section 23, he says, look, a more precise definition. So this is what I mean, where he starts with a very traditional, very simple image, which he calls a definition. It generates a tremendous amount of complexity kind of theory, and then it delivers a new definition. Precisely one that is both implicit in this definition, but not anticipated. Or at least not anticipated with the clarity of its statement. And that is the celebrated thing that, as he says here, war therefore is an act of policy or politics, politique. We'll come back to this on Schmidt, about how one can read that. And then he says, and I'll just read it because it's perhaps the most famous passage, section 24, where he says, we see therefore that war is not merely an act of policy, and that's why there's the ambiguity about what he means, but a true political instrument. So the ambiguity is, what's the difference between policy and a true political instrument? A continuation of political intercourse. So it's a very striking idea that politics is a form of intercourse, of course not sexual intercourse, don't start having lewd thoughts. Political intercourse, and inherent to the nature of politics is war. So this is why, from a contemporary point of view, Clausewitz is seen as a realist in terms of his thinking about international relations. In a sense, from a Clausewitzian point of view, you cannot somehow exorcise war from politics. Precisely because if politics is a form of antagonism, of polemos, where I'm trying to impose my will on someone else, then it is perfectly rational under certain circumstances to use violence. And at the nation state, not you as people. And then that's why he says what remains peculiar to war is simply the peculiar nature of its means. And that's a very striking statement. So war is politics. So there is no sharp distinction between war and then politics, or the idea that somehow war is the suspension of politics. War is politics. It's just a very specific form of politics. And what's specific about that form is that it requires violence, or it is the manifestation of violence. And this celebrated definition then, that war is an instrument of politics, then brings together instrument, end and objective. And here, if you want, we can discuss it, because there's also a certain level of complexity between so let's call it violence or war as an instrument. Within that instrument, there's also a distinction between end and means. Namely, as a general, you have to decide what's the proper end that you're pursuing. I take this bridge, I bomb this city, and then understand what the proper means is to that military end. And then that military end is itself an instrument for a political end. So also you can see a lot of complicated collapses of this hierarchy. When, I'll just use a historical example, carpet bombing, Laos became a military objective that started to function as a political objective. So this, you might say that that's an example where a certain military objective now displaces or usurps the political objective, and then people think, oh no, bombing is political, i.e. it serves some political purpose. So you can see that with this very neat structure of means and ends, both within the instrument of war, and then means and ends as connecting war and politics, where war itself is politics. Then you can also see interesting breakdowns as a way to understand the specific nature of war, because as I've already emphasized, Clausewitz doesn't claim that there is one form of war, because war is a chameleon. So that's why I need a vocabulary, and I need to understand the dynamics such that each war is always going to be relative to very specific circumstances. Social conditions, human psychology, contingency, levels of technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Hostility of and emotions, which I didn't talk about, but he has some interesting things to say. So there is no such thing as a concept of war. there are many different kinds of wars, but they have a kind of rationality or intelligibility. And all of them are subsumed to this basic insight that is the pursuit of politics by other means. Now, it's with that in mind, and let me just say a few things and we can just talk, that Clausewitz then, at the end of this section, has again reemphasizes the tremendous diversity of war. Within the framework of his thinking, so precisely wars of anti-colonial liberation, we would call terrorist acts today, for him are not war, because they're not among recognized sovereign states. And this is also why, as I mentioned last time, that Clausewitz, parallel to his theoretical work, produced case studies. So wrote quite wonderful historical analyses of 1806 campaign in Vienna, Napoleon's Italian campaigns, 1812 campaign, etc. Because in a sense, you need these historical case studies to look always specifically. And in this sense, Clausewitz invented a whole genre of writing, which is now, if you go to a military academy, if you go to Sacy in Paris, to the West Point, if you're an officer, that's what you're studying. You're studying, what went wrong in the first Iraq War, how did it happen, blah, blah, blah. Let's study the, Ardennes campaign of 44, or whatever. Okay. And then he comes to what he calls the consequences for theory. Now, it's most likely that these headings are not his. They're probably his wife's and a colleague who edited the book. But they nonetheless felt that this paragraph is a separate paragraph and represented something like a separate transition in the train of thought. They call it the consequences. And here, I'll just read it because it's really, I think, one of the great moments of the book. Very deep philosophically. Where he says, war is more than a true chameleon. So again, it's a great image. War is a chameleon. Because it itself is a military, the chameleon is itself a kind of military creature. Camouflage and things like that. So war is more than a true chameleon that slightly adapts its characteristics to the given case. And he's also telling you that war always has to be completely flexible to what it's doing. So to the context. As a total phenomenon, and here you can give a lot of thought to what he means by total phenomenon. Later theorists will interpret this really in the strong sense that we'll look at later in the class of the total mobilization. What Singer famously named, but was sort of understood that in the First World War, since that's sort of the historical war that we're interested in, war is not a partial phenomenon of society. It mobilizes completely a society. In fact, you might say that war is perhaps the only phenomenon in late modern culture that completely is capable, certain wars, of mobilizing a society. And the First World War and the Second World War are examples of that. Every aspect of society, indeed, and this is what this course is about, every aspect of thinking is mobilized for one activity. You can't think of another activity that has that power, socially and culturally. What Clausewitz here means is most likely not that. It's much more conceptual. But what he does mean is that it's a total phenomenon precisely in the way that the soul is a whole. So it's a whole made up of parts. And its dominant tendencies always make war a paradoxical trinity. And it's interesting why he calls it paradoxical, as opposed to just a trinity. Because the Platonic soul is, strictly speaking, not paradoxical. So again, you could ask yourself, why does he call it a paradoxical trinity? But he calls it a paradoxical trinity composed of primordial violence, hatred, and enmity, I can't pronounce that English word, which are to be regarded as blind natural force. So this is something like appetite in Plato. The play of chance and probability within which the creative spirit is free to roam. So that's something like thumos, the spiritedness of the soul. So again, if you remember in Plato's Republic, there's three. There's what he calls the appetites, lust, sex. There's what he calls in Greek thumos, which means spiritedness, and the virtues of courage and things like that are place on that. And then there's reasoning or thinking, or cognition. And here in Clausewitz's scheme, you have violence, hatred, which are a blind natural force, the play of chance and probability, which the creative spirit is free to roam. And that sentence right there is quite profound, that creativity. So the spontaneity of creativity, of the imagination, of the productive imagination, manifests itself in the context of probability and chance. So what he's also saying is to be a soldier, you have to be truly creative and inventive. Napoleon Bonaparte is clearly the person he sees there. And then the third part is what he calls, and of its element of subordination as an instrument of policy, which makes it subject to reason alone. So there is something like sensibility, understanding, and reason. And reason alone is the sovereign state, let's call it the political. And in this, you can see that what he has in mind are the three basic structures of a society, in his thinking. The people, which he associates with, again, you can see also his class. If you were a Marxist, you would say this is a typical bourgeois officer, right? Because the people are just natural, the people just want to bomb everybody. It's very easy to mobilize the people and get them against the Arabs, against the French. I mean, that's what people, so there's a kind of distrust of the people. It's the irrational part. Though it's absolutely crucial for the proper functioning of the soul. Then there is the military. The military then requires courage, creativity, exposure to risk, and a form of judgment. And the military is the organ that then is the instrument of violence. And the key term is subordinated to the political. And then with this schema of the people, let's call it the army and the state, this is then the total phenomenon of war. And then it's a trinity. So it has to be, so much like the religious image, it's the three which is one. So there are three distinct parts, but they are somehow one. And then as he says, our task is to develop a theory that maintains a balance between these three. And again, it's another great image. Like an object suspended between three magnets. I mean, that's a kind of Borgesian image. That war in its perfect functioning is this virtual object that exists suspended between three magnets. I mean, you can just go on with that image, meaning you have to get it in a perfect relationship to the three magnets, and the three magnets have to be in a perfect relationship to each other so there's no distortion. If I were a computer genius, I would think of how you could visualize that. Because then if you move the magnets, then the image gets warped and shaped and things like that. So you can see the delicate operation of knowing how to really, in a sense, how war should be realized is a quite delicate operation. It's almost like trying to have something being held suspended in air by three magnets, and the three magnets are themselves somehow in motion. So the military has its interests, the government has its interests, and the people. And then you can see all the various kinds of conflicts that can emerge. So, in the example of, the army as an instrument becomes too much subservient to political aims. Political aims which no longer are political. World War II, the Nazis, the Wehrmacht. Or the people now becomes the army. And it's through the fusion of the people and the army that the very notion of the state will become created. Now, so you can see how I just give these two examples. It's an absolutely brilliant model, not meant to explain anything, but meant to give you a kind of prism where you can see the tremendous complexity of relations in the context of war. So war is not simply about the army and the state; it's also about the people. That's why what he's saying is that war is fundamentally a social and cultural phenomenon. It's not just, and that's why it's interesting, it's not just an instrument, because it's a total phenomenon. And that's exactly what Raymond Aron says. Here in this last page, something very new is being developed or proposed vis-a-vis what has been presented, because it's clear that when now we think about war with this matrix, if you wish, it's not simply an instrument. In fact, it's a total phenomenon. Okay, so now I thought we could just discuss it, or what I tried to do is just show you first the tremendous sophistication of, I don't know, 15 pages, which are not really fully written, because they're written sort of these blasts and editing is done by Word. And to show you that there's a kind of very interesting philosophical logic, a kind of method. And so now I thought what we could do, so we have about 40 minutes, half an hour to do this, is if then since the point of philosophy is not just for me to speak to you, but it's also for you to speak. So we can just discuss it, or if you have questions, or things also which I didn't talk about, because there's always these, in Clausewitz, there's always these wonderful little moments where he says these little things, or he makes a distinction, for example, between hostile intention and hostile feelings, and then we talk about it. So if there's anything also that you want to bring into discussion, or you want to come back to, or just you have something to say. Yes?
It's not very clear to me, but I don't know what to do with this notion of politics or policy, because as the celebrated definition states, war is one way to pursue some political aims, but at the same time we could argue that politics, per definition, exclude wars. And if we try to include an ethical dimension to politics, then it takes pages to define war, or different understandings of wars, and it doesn't say anything about politics. So,
well, you're absolutely right. I think you say two things that strike me as important. One is, again, I'll use an American idiom. The $64,000 question, which I guess in the 50s was a lot of money. It was a funny game show. Today, $64,000, no one cares. It's what you make at Google and all that. But the $64,000 question is, what does Clausewitz mean by politics? He doesn't. I mean, so there is no theory of politics. There's the term that he uses. There's the term that clearly has a very definite meaning in the context of this argument, let's say. But Clausewitz doesn't have a theory of the state, doesn't have a theory of politics, et cetera, et cetera. So now we have a kind of hermeneutical problem. How do we understand what Clausewitz meant or understood when he speaks of politique and when he thinks of the political state? That's largely a historical question, because Clausewitz himself says nothing theoretically about it. Again, he's not a political theorist, he's a military theorist. What we can reconstruct is that Clausewitz is committed, if you wish to put it in that formulaic language, to at least three basic ideas. One is, as I mentioned, for him, political agents are sovereign states. So only sovereign states truly have politics. Hamas doesn't. Whatever, you get the example. The second is that these political states, or these nation states, have self-interests. What we would call today national interests. And those national interests are whatever a state, through its own decision-making process, decides is a national interest. We need this oil, borders, et cetera, et cetera. And the third, and this is, again, we can infer it just based on, he was a soldier,